Two bullets enter the cockpit at 300 miles per hour. The first ricochets off metal goggles, fracturing bone and blinding the right eye. The second tears through leather and skull at the temple, puncturing brain tissue, paralyzing the left side of the body. Blood floods the cockpit of the Mitsubishi A6M0, mixing with hydraulic fluid and the salt spray of the Pacific wind that screams through the shattered canopy. The pilot, Saburo Sakai, has 4 hours and 47 minutes to fly 560 nautical miles back to Rabaul, or he will die in the ocean. He flies with one eye, one arm, and consciousness that flickers like a failing radio signal. 40-5 years later, that same pilot sits in a living room in Tacoma, Washington, holding a white silk scarf torn by wind and blood. Across from him sits the son of a man he killed on June 9, 1942, over the waters of New Guinea. Between them lies something neither war nor time could destroy: the capacity for men to recognize each other's humanity across an ocean of grief. This is not a story about mercy on the battlefield. There was no mercy on June 9, 1942. Lieutenant Colonel Francis R. Stevens died instantly when 20mm cannon shells from Sockeye Zero tore through the fuselage of his B-26 Marauder, the Wabash Cannonball. The bomber fell into the sea off Lae, taking all aboard to depths from which they would never be recovered. Sockeye did not know the name of the man he had killed. Stevens' son, then a boy, did not know the name of his father's killer. But both names were written in the ledger of the Pacific War, and those ledgers would eventually be opened. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the Pacific War forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The search that followed was not a hunt for revenge. It was a hunt for understanding, for completion, for the one question that haunts every child who loses a parent to war. Who was the man who pulled the trigger? And could that man explain what cannot be explained? The answer would take nearly half a century to find, and when it came, it would arrive not as closure, but as a beginning. The beginning of an impossible friendship, forged in the same fire that had destroyed it. In the spring of 1942, the Empire of Japan stood at the zenith of its power. From the smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor to the fall of Singapore, from the jungles of Burma to the coral atolls of the Central Pacific, Japanese forces had achieved in 6 months what military planners had thought impossible. The key to this conquest flew on wings of aluminum and canvas, powered by engines that burned with a precision that Western intelligence had badly underestimated. The Mitsubishi A6M0, designated Type 0 Carrier Fighter Model 21, represented the culmination of a design philosophy that prioritized range and maneuverability over all else. The Zero specifications told the story of Japan's strategic vision. Powered by a Nakajima Sake 12 radial engine producing 940 horsepower, the aircraft weighed just 3,704 pounds empty and 6,164 pounds fully loaded. This gave it a power-to-weight ratio that no American fighter could match in 1942. Maximum speed reached 316 miles per hour at 11,810 feet. Service ceiling topped 33,800 feet. But the number that mattered most was range: 1,930 miles with external drop tanks. This meant Japanese fighters could escort bombers deep into enemy territory and return a capability that shocked Allied air commanders who had designed their defensive strategies around the assumption that enemy fighters would lack the fuel to reach them. The armament. REFLECTED Japanese Tactical Doctrine. 220mm Type 99 cannon mounted in the wings provided devastating punch against bombers and could shred enemy fighters with a single burst. Two 7.7mm Type 97 machine guns in the engine cowling offered high rate of fire for close-in dogfighting. The combination was lethal in the hands of pilots trained to an extraordinary degree. Saburo Sakai embodied that training. Born in 1916 to a family of samurai ancestry reduced to farming, he had enlisted in the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1933 at age 16. By 1937, he had been accepted into flight training, a selection process so rigorous that only 10% of candidates succeeded. The training itself was brutal. Instructors struck students who made errors. Physical conditioning included runs of 10 miles in full gear. Gunnery practice continued until every pilot could hit a target the size of a man's head at 250 meters. Navigation training required flying by dead reckoning across open ocean with no instruments beyond compass and watch. Sakai first saw combat over China in 1938, flying the F-5M Type 96 fighter. There he learned the fundamentals that would keep him alive through 4 years of war: maintain altitude advantage, attack from the sun, conserve ammunition, never follow a damaged enemy down. By May 1942, when he joined the Tainan Kakutai at Lae, New Guinea, he had accumulated 28 confirmed kills and a reputation as one of the Imperial Navy's finest pilots. The Tainan Air Group was the elite, the men who would face the initial Allied counteroffensive in the Southwest Pacific. On the American side, the situation in the spring of 1942 bordered on desperate. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, faced a Japanese force that had proven itself superior in nearly every engagement. His air forces consisted of whatever could be scraped together and flown across the Pacific. These 17 flying fortresses too valuable to risk in low-level attacks. B-25 Mitchells still being adapted to theater conditions. And B-26 Marauders. That cruise had nicknamed the Widowmaker for its high landing speed and unforgiving flight characteristics. The B-26 Marauder represented American industrial power applied to aerial warfare. Designed by Glenn Martin Company, it was a shoulder-winged monoplane with a circular fuselage and tricycle landing gear. 2 Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engines, each producing 1,920 horsepower, pushed the aircraft to a maximum speed of 282 miles per hour faster than many fighters then in service. But speed came at a cost. Wing loading reached 58 pounds per square foot, requiring a landing speed of 130 miles per hour, faster than any previous American bomber. Crew said the B-26 had no glide ratio. It flew or it fell. The B-26's defensive armament in early 1942 consisted of a flexible .50 caliber machine gun in the nose, a twin .50 caliber mount in the dorsal turret, a single .50 caliber weapon in each waist position, and a .30 caliber machine gun in the tail position. This firepower could shred an attacker at close range, but the guns required manual aiming while the aircraft maneuvered. And in the crucial first seconds of an attack, most gunners never saw the zero coming. Standard crew for Pacific operations numbered 7: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, radio operator, and 2 gunners. Most were in their early 20s, fresh from training that emphasized procedure but could never replicate the chaos of combat. A handful of older officers provided leadership and operational experience. Lieutenant Colonel Francis R. Stevens was one of these men. Stevens came to the Pacific Theater not as a bomber pilot, but as a staff officer assigned to the Operations Division of the War Department in Washington. Serving under General George C. Marshall, his mission was assessment, not combat. Marshall needed accurate intelligence about MacArthur's operations, and MacArthur's dispatches provided more requests than information. The general's strategy appeared to be that by revealing nothing, he could prevent higher command from interfering. Marshall's solution was to send 2 qualified officers to observe and report. One was Stevens. The other was Lieutenant Colonel Samuel E. Anderson, an experienced Air Corps officer Halfway across the Pacific, Stevens and Anderson encountered an unlikely third observer, Representative Lyndon Baines Johnson of Texas, operating under orders from President Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt faced a political problem. Johnson, a Navy Reserve commander, had agitated for combat assignment. If one congressman went to war, others would follow. Roosevelt's solution was temporary orders for Johnson to observe Pacific operations, followed by an executive order prohibiting members of Congress from active military service. They could serve their country in Congress or in uniform, but not both. The three men joined forces at MacArthur's headquarters in Brisbane, Australia. After briefings and inspections, they determined to see combat operations firsthand. This meant flying north to Port Moresby, New Guinea, and joining a bombing mission against Japanese positions. MacArthur agreed, seeing propaganda value in congressional presence at the front. On June 8, 1942, the three observers arrived at Garbutt Field near Townsville, Australia, where they would board B-26s for an attack on Lae Aerodrome the following morning. The mission would consist of 11 Marauders attacking at low level after diversionary. Raids by B-17s and B-25s drew off Japanese fighters. Intelligence indicated moderate anti-aircraft defenses and estimated 15 to 20 Zero fighters based at Lae. Weather forecast called for scattered clouds at 6,000 feet. Visibility Unlimited. No intelligence report mentioned that Lae hosted not ordinary pilots, but the Tainen Kakutai, and that among them flew Saburo Sakai. The Zero's design philosophy emerged from Japan's unique strategic position. As an island nation with limited resources, Japan could not afford to build heavy, armored aircraft that consumed enormous quantities of fuel and raw materials. Instead, Japanese designers chose speed, range, and maneuverability. The S-6M achieved its extraordinary performance through radical weight reduction. Where American fighters used armor plate around cockpits and fuel tanks, the Zero used aluminum barely thicker than aircraft skin. Where American aircraft carried self-sealing fuel tanks lined with rubber compounds, the Zero's tanks were simple aluminum shells that saved weight but burned like torches when hit. The trade-off was conscious and calculated. Japanese pilots would rely on skill and tactics rather than protection. This philosophy created aircraft that could outfight and outfly anything in the Pacific sky in 1942, but only in the hands of superbly trained pilots. The Tainen Kakutai represented the apex of that training. Based at Tainen on Formosa during the early war, the unit had moved to Lae in April 1942 to support operations in New Guinea and the Solomons. Among its pilots were men who would become legends. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, eventually credited with 87 victories before his death in transport aircraft over the Philippines. Toshio Oda, the quiet perfectionist who scored 34 kills. And Saburo Sakai, the survivor who would outlive them all. The three men formed what their comrades called the cleanup trio. When bomber formations proved too tough for ordinary pilots, these three would finish the job. Their tactics emphasized patience and precision. They would study a formation for minutes, identifying the weakest aircraft, the wounded stragglers, the gaps in defensive fire. Then they would strike with the efficiency of surgeons, using minimum ammunition to achieve maximum damage. Sakai's personal method was to close to within 50 meters before firing, ensuring that every round counted. At that range, a 2-second burst from his 20mm cannon could cut a bomber in half. The B-26 Marauder emerged from a different philosophy entirely. American designers assumed that industrial capacity could solve any tactical problem. If enemy fighters were too fast, build bombers that were faster. If defensive firepower was insufficient, mount more guns. If crews were inexperienced, create aircraft so rugged they could survive pilot error and battle damage. The B-26 embodied this thinking. Its circular fuselage was immensely strong, capable of absorbing tremendous punishment. Its twin engines provided redundancy, losing one still meant getting home. Its speed made interception difficult for older fighters, but the Marauder's reputation as the Widowmaker was well earned. Its high wing loading and fast landing speed left no margin for error. Training accidents killed more crews than combat in the aircraft's early service. Pilots said the B-26 approached like a freight train and landed like a brick. There was no gentle touchdown. The aircraft hit the runway and stayed down through brute force and excellent brakes. Once airborne, however, the B-26 was stable and fast, capable of carrying 4,000 pounds of bombs over 1,150 miles at 282 miles per hour. The mission planned for June 9, 1942, would test both philosophies. 11 B-26s would attack Lae at low level, flying barely above the water to avoid radar detection. The approach would be coordinated with diversionary attacks by B-17s and B-25s, forcing Japanese fighters to divide their attention. Each B-26 carried 3,100-pound general-purpose bombs, fused for instantaneous detonation. The target was Lae Aerodrome itself, runways, hangars, fuel dumps, and aircraft on the ground. If successful, the raid would cripple Japanese air power in the region for weeks. Johnson had originally claimed a seat aboard the Wabash Cannonball. Piloted by Captain Walt Greer, the congressman brought his camera, planning to document the mission for political purposes back home. But as engines warmed up on the morning of June 9th, Johnson realized he had forgotten to load film. He left the aircraft to retrieve it from his quarters. Stevens, unaware of Johnson's plans to return, settled into the vacated seat. When Johnson came back, Stevens joked that the congressman would have to find another aircraft. Johnson boarded a different B-26, one that would develop engine trouble and turn back before reaching the target. The seat switch would determine who lived and who died. But neither man knew that as engines started and propellers bit into the humid Australian air at Lae, Saburo Sakai completed his pre-flight inspection as dawn broke over the Huon Gulf. His zero tail number V-103 had been serviced overnight by ground crew who knew their pilot's reputation. Every rivet was tight, every control surface true. The Nakajima Sake engine had been warmed and tested. Fuel tanks were topped off 87-octane gasoline in the main tanks. Drop tanks hung beneath the wings for extended range. Ammunition bins held 60 rounds of 20mm high-explosive shells and 700 rounds of 7.7mm all ammunition. Sake's routine never varied. He checked control surface movement, tested radio communication, verified instrument readings. He examined his parachute and Mae West life vest. Though both were nearly useless over the vast Pacific distances flown in 1942, he cleaned his goggles and checked the silk scarf he wore for luck. White silk embroidered with cherry blossoms, a gift from his sister. The leather flying helmet bore the scars of 3 years of combat, oil stains, sweat marks, and a small tear from shrapnel over Port Moresby. The previous month, the Tainan Kakutai had been on alert since 0800 hours. Intelligence reported American bomber formations assembling at Australian bases, but exact targets remained unknown. Lae was an obvious choice, the main Japanese airbase in New Guinea, home to fighters and bombers that struck Allied shipping throughout the region. The pilots waited in the ready tent, playing cards or writing letters home. Sake cleaned his pistol, a ritual that calmed his nerves. Some men smoked. Others slept. All listened for the telephone that would send them scrambling to their aircraft at 0925 hours. 11 B-26s lifted off from Garbutt Field in 30-second intervals. The formation assembled at 8,000 feet before turning northeast toward the Coral Sea. Each aircraft carried 7 men and 3,000 pounds of bombs. Fuel load was calculated to provide 6 hours of flight time, enough to reach Lai, attack, and return with 30 minutes reserve. Radio silence was absolute. Navigation depended on dead reckoning and celestial shots taken through astrodomes and aircraft roofs. The flight north lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. Below, the Coral Sea stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface broken only by whitecaps and the occasional cloud shadow. Flying at 8,000 feet, the bombers encountered scattered clouds but maintained formation integrity. Pilots monitored engine temperatures, fuel consumption, and oil pressure. Bombardiers armed their bombs and checked intervalometer settings. Gunners test-fired their weapons into empty ocean. The sound of .50 caliber machine guns, barely audible over twin R2800 engines. Stevens rode in the right waist gunner position, operating a single .50 caliber machine gun mounted on a flexible ring. His job was observation rather than combat, to witness and report what happened during the attack. He had never fired a machine gun in anger. His experience was limited to staff work, planning operations rather than executing them. But his view from the Wabash Cannonball's waist window gave him an unobstructed panorama of sea and sky as the formation flew north toward its destiny. At 11:45 hours. The New Guinea coastline appeared ahead, a dark green mass rising from turquoise water. The formation descended to 6,000 feet and turned northwest, following the coast toward Lai. Below, jungle canopy stretched unbroken, except for rivers that gleamed like silver threads in the tropical sun. No roads were visible, no signs of human habitation. This was country where aircraft flew or died. No forced landing was possible in that terrain. At Lai, the telephone rang at 11:47 hours. Radar operators reported inbound aircraft bearing 150 degrees, distance 80 miles, altitude approximately 6,000 feet. The duty officer's voice was calm. Scramble all available aircraft. Pilots dropped cards and letters and ran for their zeros. Ground crew had already started engines. Propellers turned lazily as pilots strapped in and advanced throttles. The first zero was airborne within 3 minutes of the alert. Sakai's aircraft was fifth off the runway. He climbed steeply to the northwest, following the lead aircraft toward the reported contact. 11 zeros were airborne within 6 minutes, not the entire complement of the Tainan Kakutai, but enough to handle a formation of American bombers. Climbing at 3,000 feet per minute, the fighters reached 15,000 feet and began searching for their targets. The American formation was easy to spot. 11 dark shapes against white clouds. Flying in loose V formation toward Lai, the Japanese fighters had altitude and position advantage, approaching from the northwest with the sun at their backs. Sakai studied the bomber formation through binoculars, identifying aircraft type and defensive positions. B-26 Marauders fast for bombers, heavily armed, flying tight formation for mutual protection. The attack would require precision. The lead Zero pilot, Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Uki, made hand signals indicating attack formation. The Zeros would split into 2 groups, attacking from opposite directions to divide defensive fire. Sakai's group would approach from starboard, the others from port. Each pilot would select individual targets and press attacks to minimum range. Speed would be their protection. Get in, fire, get out before American gunners could track them effectively. At 12:03 hours, the first Zero dove on the bomber formation. Stevens saw it coming, a small silver shape plunging from high altitude, growing larger with terrifying speed. He swung his machine gun around and opened fire, but the Zero was already past, cannon shells sparkling along the bomber's wing. The attack lasted 3 seconds. Then another Zero appeared, and another. Sakai selected the Wabash Cannonball. third aircraft in the right element. His approach was textbook, perfect high-speed pass from the beam, pulling lead to account for the bomber's forward motion. At 200 meters, he could see individual crew members through the aircraft's windows. At 100 meters, he pressed the firing button. Two 20mm cannon shells and a stream of 7.7mm bullets converged on the B-26's fuselage. The shells hit just behind the cockpit, exploding inside the fuselage with devastating effect. Stevens was killed instantly, along with the radio operator and dorsal gunner. The bomber lurched sideways as Captain Greer fought to maintain control, but hydraulic lines were severed and control cables cut. The Wabash cannonball entered a shallow dive toward the sea, leaving a trail of smoke and debris. Sakai pulled up and away, following standard tactics. He did not watch the bomber crash. His attention was already shifting to other targets. 3 more Zeros were attacking the formation, and American gunners were beginning to respond effectively. Tracers filled the air like deadly fireflies. The engagement lasted 8 minutes from first attack to final break-off. When it ended, 2 B-26s had been shot down and 3 others damaged. The surviving bombers jettisoned their loads and fled south toward Australia. For Sakai, it was routine combat. He had engaged enemy bombers, fired 30 rounds of 20mm ammunition and 150 rounds of 7.7mm, achieved 1 confirmed kill, and returned to base undamaged. His aircraft was refueled and rearmed for another mission that never came. He did not know the name of the man he had killed. He did not know that Francis R. Stevens left behind a wife and 3 children, or that those children would grow up with questions about their father's death that would take decades to answer. The Wabash cannonball hit the water at 175 miles per hour, disappearing beneath the surface in seconds. The crew of 7 was never recovered. Johnson's aircraft, having turned back with engine trouble, landed safely at Port Moresby. The Congressman's Silver Star citation would later describe his gallant action during a mission he never completed. Awarded by MacArthur, who understood the political value of congressional heroism, 2 months and 29 days later, Saburo Sakai would learn what it meant to be the hunted rather than the hunter. On August 7, 1942, United States Marines stormed ashore on Guadalcanal and Tulagi, beginning the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific. The Tainan Kakitai, now based at Rabaul, scrambled every available aircraft to counterattack. Sakai was among them, leading a formation of Zeros on the 560-mile flight to the invasion beaches. The morning was clear, visibility unlimited over the Solomon Sea. Sakai's Zero hung smoothly at 15,000 feet. Engine temperature normal, fuel consumption as calculated. Below, the ocean stretched empty except for cloud shadows that raced across the surface like dark birds. Radio chatter was minimal. Hand signals sufficed for formation changes. The flight to Guadalcanal took 2 hours and 15 minutes. Following a route Sakai had flown many times during the campaign for the Southern SOLOMON Stad as they approached Guadalcanal. Smoke columns were visible rising from the invasion beaches. American ships filled Seal Arc Channel transports, destroyers, cruisers, and carriers. Aircraft circled overhead like protected wasps. This would not be another routine bomber interception. The Americans had come to stay, and they had brought everything they possessed to make it possible. Sakai spotted aircraft below and to the right several twin-engine planes flying in loose formation. His experience identified them as easy targets, probably torpedo bombers or dive bombers returning from attacks on Japanese positions. He led his formation down in a high-speed attack, closing to 100 meters before realizing his fatal error. These were not helpless bombers, but Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, each mounting twin .30 caliber machine guns in a rear cockpit manned by a trained gunner. The first burst caught Sakai Zero in the engine. shattering cylinders and igniting fuel lines. The second burst, from another SBD, found the cockpit. One bullet struck his flying goggles. The impact transmitted through the metal frames to crush bone around his right eye. The eye went dark instantly, filling with blood. The second bullet penetrated his leather helmet at the right temple, punching through skull and brain tissue before lodging in the left side of his head. Blood erupted from both wounds, flooding the cockpit and covering instrument dials. Sake's left arm went numb, then completely paralyzed. His left leg lost all feeling. The Zero lurched sideways as his right hand spasmed on the control stick. Through his remaining eye, he watched American fighters converging for the kill. His engine was smoking, his canopy was shattered, and he was bleeding to death at 240 miles per hour. What followed was a demonstration of will that defied medical possibility. Sake had 560 nautical miles to fly to reach Rabaul, the nearest Japanese base. His aircraft was badly damaged, leaking fuel and oil. His wounds were severe enough that American fighter pilots, seeing the blood-soaked cockpit, broke off their attacks, assuming he was already dead. But Sake was not dead. He was flying on pure determination, navigating by compass and dead, reckoning with an aircraft that wanted to spiral into the sea. The flight took 4 hours and 47 minutes. Sake lost consciousness repeatedly as blood loss and shock took their toll. Each time he fainted, the Zero's nose would drop toward the water, the change in attitude jerking him back to awareness. He learned to use pain as an alarm clock, striking his shattered eye socket with his good hand to maintain consciousness. The wind screaming through his destroyed canopy helped too, the noise and cold spray keeping him marginally alert. Navigation became a nightmare. With one eye gone and the other filling with blood, he could barely read his compass. The fuel gauge was obscured by gore. He flew by instinct and memory, following headings burned into his brain by hundreds of previous flights. When clouds blocked his view of the sun, he navigated by the color of the water, by wind patterns on the surface, by the flight paths of seabirds heading toward distant land. Fuel consumption increased as his damaged engine consumed oil and gasoline at rates far above normal. Sake calculated he had perhaps 30 minutes of flying time remaining when the mountains of New Britain finally appeared ahead. Rabaul lay beyond those mountains, but his fuel might not last. He considered ditching in the ocean, but his injuries made survival in the water impossible. He flew on, trading altitude for distance, nursing every drop of fuel dot. The Lakunai airfield at Rabaul appeared at 15:47 hours local time. Sake made a straight-in approach, too weak to attempt a proper traffic pattern. His landing was controlled crash to zero, hit the runway at 110 miles per hour, and bounced twice before rolling to a stop. Ground crew running toward the aircraft stopped in shock at the carnage visible through the shattered canopy. They found Sake unconscious, slumped over his controls, his white silk scarf soaked crimson with blood. Medical officers later said he should have died within minutes of being hit. The bullet that destroyed his eye had fractured the orbital socket and damaged the optic nerve permanently. The second bullet had penetrated his temporal lobe, causing the paralysis and nearly killing him instantly. His survival of the 4-hour flight was medically impossible, explicable only by willpower that transcended normal human limits. Recovery took months. Sake regained partial use of his left arm and leg, but his right eye remained permanently blind. Depth perception was gone forever, ending his career as a fighter pilot. He returned to Japan in late 1942, spending the remainder of the war as a flight instructor, teaching young pilots who would die in battles he could no longer fight. By war's end, his final tally stood at 64 confirmed victories, making him one of Japan's leading aces. After Japan's surrender, Sake faced an uncertain future. The Imperial Navy no longer existed. His skills as a pilot were unmarketable in a defeated nation, forbidden to maintain military aviation. He worked as a printer, then as a Buddhist temple groundskeeper, finding peace in tending gardens and contemplating the cost of the war he had survived. He married, raised a family, and tried to forget the violence that had defined his youth. But the war would not forget him, nor he it. In 1957, American aviation enthusiast Martin Caidin tracked him down for interviews about Japanese fighter tactics. Sakei's story, published as Samurai, became an international bestseller, introducing Western readers to the human face of their former enemy. The book led to air show appearances in the United States, where Sakei met former American pilots and discovered that warriors could recognize, honor in each other, regardless of which flag they had. Served. Francis R. Stevens, Jr. knew nothing of Sakei's survival. When he began his own quest in the 1960s, the son had grown up with fragmentary knowledge of his father's death, stories told by his maternal grandfather, official casualty notifications, and a persistent belief that somewhere in military archives lay photographic evidence of the action that killed Lieutenant Colonel Stevens. The search began almost by accident in 1964, when Stevens, Jr., then a young Army officer attending Columbia University, happened upon a magazine article about aerial combat photography. The magazine was Man's World, and Stevens was reading it in a German barbershop while stationed overseas. The article was titled "The World's Greatest Air Combat Photos," and included a sequence showing a twin-engine bomber being shot down over water. The images were grainy but dramatic, an aircraft in its final moments, trailing smoke and debris as it fell toward the sea. Stevens wrote to the magazine, asking if the editors could identify the date and location. They could not, but they provided the name and address of the man who had assembled the article. Martin Caidin. Caidin was already known as an aviation historian and would later achieve fame as the author of Cyborg, the novel that inspired television's $6 Million Man. When Stevens contacted him, Caidin was collaborating with Edward Heimoff on a biography of Lyndon Johnson's military service. The timing was significant. Johnson had become president following Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, and publishers wanted books about the new chief executive's background. The meeting occurred in January 1964 in a hotel suite in Manhattan. Stevens found Caidin and Heimoff surrounded by photographs, documents, and handwritten notes covering every wall. Among them, arranged with systematic precision, were the materials Stevens had spent years hoping to find: a series of photographs showing his father's aircraft being shot down, a portrait of the Japanese pilot who had fired the fatal burst, a group photograph of Tainan Kokutai pilots taken minutes before the attack, and a detailed written account by Saburo Sakei describing the engagement. The emotional impact was overwhelming. For 22 years, Stevens had lived with abstract knowledge of his father's death. Now he faced concrete evidence, images of the Wabash Cannonball's final moments, the face of the man who had killed Francis R. Stevens Sr., and a minute-by-minute description of the action written by the killer himself. Sakei's account was clinically precise, devoid of emotion or regret. It described target selection, attack angles, ammunition expenditure, and results achieved. The death of 7 Americans was recorded as a routine tactical success. Caidin explained how the materials had been assembled. The photographs came from Japanese military archives, captured after the war and stored in American intelligence files. Sakei's written account was part of his debriefing after the mission, preserved in Tainan Kokutai records. The group photograph of pilots had been taken by a Japanese war correspondent minutes before the scramble alert, intended for propaganda purposes that were never fulfilled. Together, They provided a complete picture of June 9, 1942. From the Japanese perspective, Stevens also learned the ironic details of the seat exchange that had determined his father's fate. Johnson's forgotten camera, the impromptu seating change, the engine trouble that forced Johnson's aircraft to abort a chain of trivial incidents. That meant life for a future president and death for a staff officer whose mission was observation, not combat. History had turned on a bathroom break and a forgotten piece of equipment. But knowing the killer's identity was not enough. Stevens wanted to meet Saburo Sakai, to look into the face of the man who had destroyed his family and try to understand what could not be understood. The opportunity would not come for more than 20 years. Stevens pursued his Army career, serving in Vietnam and various stateside assignments, but he kept watch for news of Sakai's activities. He learned that the former ace had become something of a celebrity in aviation circles, appearing at air shows and military reunions, always as an advocate for reconciliation rather than a defender of Japan's wartime actions. In July 1987, Stevens was living in Tacoma, Washington, having retired from the Army and begun a civilian career in computer systems. His wife Nancy found a newspaper article about Sakai's appearance at the Yakima Air Show, held annually in the valley east of the Cascade Mountains. The article mentioned that this was Sakai's regular appearance, suggesting he might return in future years. Nancy made a mental note to watch for announcements of his next visit. The opportunity came on a Sunday morning in 1988, when Nancy opened their local newspaper to find an announcement that Sakai would appear that very day at the Yakima Air Show. Stevens immediately called the airfield manager but got no answer. Offices were closed on Sunday. Nancy's response was characteristically direct. They would drive to Yakima and see what happened. It seemed like a 4-hour wild goose chase, but Stevens got in the car for the 2-hour drive across the mountains. Yakima proved more accessible than expected. A police officer at the airfield directed them to the VIP pavilion, though he warned that security was tight due to threats against Sakai's life. At the pavilion, Stevens encountered a bodyguard who epitomized the phrase muscle-bound, 6.5 feet tall, 250 pounds of what appeared to be solid muscle. When Stevens explained that he wanted to see Saburo Sakai, the obvious question was why. Stevens answered with simple truth. Sakai had killed his father 45 years earlier. The bodyguard's suspicion was understandable and justified. But after weighing the statement for several moments, he apparently decided that the story was too implausible to be anything but truthful. He said he would see what he could do, then thoroughly searched both Stevens and his wife before leaving them under guard. Several minutes later, the bodyguard returned with a benevolent-looking Asian gentleman whose presence radiated dignity and calm. This was Saburo Sakai at age 72, bearing the scars of his war wounds, but still carrying himself with the bearing of a professional warrior. Communication required an interpreter, Jim Crossley, who had accompanied Sakai to translate at the air show. The initial conversation lasted 20 minutes. Sakai began with an apology for killing Stevens' father, delivered through Crossley with formal courtesy. Stevens responded with equal formality, assuring Sakai that he bore no malice. His father's death had been the act of a soldier performing his duty in wartime. Both men understood the code that governed their exchange. Warriors could respect each other across the lines of former conflict. The meeting led to an invitation that would have seemed impossible 46 years earlier. Sakai accepted Stevens' offer to spend the night in their Tacoma home after the air show's conclusion. He arrived in the late afternoon, accompanied by a Japanese-American woman who would serve as translator for the evening. What followed was a ceremony that transcended cultural and linguistic barriers, touching something fundamental about war, death, and reconciliation. Sakai's first request was for an article of clothing that had belonged to Stevens' father. When Stevens retrieved his father's West Point sweater carried with him since his own cadet days, Sakai placed it on the living room coffee table and said a brief Shinto prayer over it. Speaking through his translator, he explained that this prayer, from one warrior to another whom he had slain, would assure Francis R. Stevens Sr. an elevation of several levels in heaven above, wherever his own merits had originally placed him. The ceremony was simple, lasting perhaps 3 minutes, but its impact was profound. Stevens Jr., though not particularly religious, found himself moved by the sincerity and dignity of the gesture. Here was his father's killer performing a ritual designed to benefit his father's soul, an act of spiritual generosity that transformed the relationship between them from one of guilt and loss to one of mutual recognition. Sakai then produced the items he had brought from Japan, the leather pilot helmet and white silk scarf he had worn on June 9, 1942. These were the same items he had worn during his wounding over Guadalcanal 2 months later, and the evidence was clearly visible. The helmet showed where one bullet had ricocheted off his goggles, crushing the metal frames and fracturing the bone around his eye. The leather was torn at the temple where the second bullet had penetrated, leaving a hole large enough to insert a finger. The silk scarf told an even more dramatic story. It was tattered in a symmetrical pattern, torn by the wind that had screamed through Sakai's shattered canopy during the 4-hour flight back to Rabaul. The damage was not from age or wear, but from a single, traumatic incident, the desperate flight of a dying pilot who refused to die. Sakai explained how the wind had been both curse and blessing, torturing his wounds but keeping him conscious through the endless hours over empty ocean. The conversation that evening ranged across decades and continents, touching on subjects that only warriors could fully understand. Sakai described the tactical details of aerial combat with the precision of an instructor, explaining how Zero pilots use speed and maneuverability to overcome American advantages in firepower and armor. Stevens shared his father's background and his own military career, including service in Vietnam, where the lessons of Pacific air combat had been relearned in a different war, against a different enemy. The most moving moment came when Stevens mentioned that his eldest daughter was attending flight training in Arizona, preparing to become a pilot in the United States Air Force. Sakai was visibly affected by this news, seeing it as continuation of the warrior bloodline into the next generation. That it was a woman carrying this tradition into aviation made it even more significant to him, a validation that the warrior spirit transcended gender as well as nationality. Sakai's response was to tear a piece from his battle-damaged scarf and present it to Stevens with specific instructions. "Give it to his daughter," he said, "and tell her to carry it whenever she flies. If she does, whatever gods there are will protect her from the perils of the air." The gift was both practical and mystical, a talisman created from the fabric that had absorbed a warrior's blood and been blessed by his survival. Stevens' daughter did carry the silk fragment throughout her Air Force career, and though Stevens remained skeptical of supernatural intervention, he found comfort in knowing she flew under Sakai's protection. The silk had survived one impossible flight. Perhaps it could safeguard another pilot through the dangers that aviation would always present. The friendship that began that evening endured for the remainder of Sakai's life. Stevens and Sakai corresponded regularly, sharing updates on their families and reflections on their shared history. Sakai made additional visits to the United States, always welcomed in the Stevens home. The relationship was unique in military history. A killer and the son of his victim becoming not just reconciled, but genuinely affectionate toward each other. Sakai's post-war transformation was as remarkable as his wartime survival. After becoming a Buddhist acolyte, he had vowed never again to kill any living thing. even a mosquito. This commitment was absolute and practical. He became a vegetarian, refused to use insecticides, and devoted himself to gardening and meditation. The man who had once destroyed aircraft with ruthless efficiency now found peace in nurturing plants and contemplating the wheel of existence that had brought him from warrior to gardener. His regular visits to the United States served multiple purposes. He participated in air shows and military reunions, always as an advocate for peace rather than a nostalgic warrior reliving past glories. He met former American pilots, including men who had flown against him during the war, and discovered that professional respect could bridge even the deepest cultural divides. His presence at these events was both educational and healing, showing audiences that former enemies could recognize each other's humanity. Sakai's own family reflected this reconciliation. His daughter married an officer in the United States Army, creating blood ties between the families of former enemies. When she moved to America, Sakai visited regularly, becoming as much American grandfather as Japanese veteran. His grandchildren grew up bilingual and bicultural, living embodiments of the peace their grandfather had helped create. The airshow circuit provided Sakai with a platform for sharing lessons that transcended military tactics. He spoke about the cost of war, the value of honor, and the possibility of redemption. Young pilots sought his advice not just about flying techniques, but about the warrior's code that had sustained him through combat and captivity. His message was consistent: serve your country with honor. But remember that your enemies are also human beings serving their countries with equal honor. Stevens and Sakai's friendship provided both men with something they had not known they needed. For Stevens, it offered completion, the ability to see his father's death not as meaningless tragedy, but as part of a larger story that included survival, honor, and ultimate reconciliation. For Sakai, it provided absolution proof that the wounds of war could heal and that former enemies could become family. The authenticity of their relationship contrasted sharply with other supposed reconciliation stories that emerged from the Pacific War. The tale of Gregory Pappy Boyington and Masajiro Mike Kawato, for example, was later exposed as largely fabricated, a story created for publicity purposes that had little basis in fact. Boyington and Kawato had indeed met, but their supposed friendship was manufactured for airshow audiences, hungry for redemptive narratives. Stevens and Sakai's story was different. It was documented by photographs, written accounts, and multiple witnesses. More importantly, it was verified by the participants themselves, neither of whom sought publicity or profit from their relationship. Their meetings were private affairs, their correspondence personal, their friendship genuine. They met as men seeking understanding, not as performers creating entertainment. On September 22, 2000, Saburo Sakai died of a heart attack at Atsugi Naval Air Station, the same base from which he had flown his first combat mission 60 years earlier. He was 84 years old and had lived long enough to see former enemies become allies, former battlefields become peaceful cities, and former hatred transform into friendship. The location of his death was symbolic. He was reaching across a table to shake hands with another veteran when his heart stopped. His final act, one of reconciliation rather than conflict. Stevens learned of Sakai's death through a phone call from Japan, where the old pilot's passing was front-page news. The obituaries described his war record, his survival of wounds that should have killed him, and his post-war transformation into an advocate for peace. But for Stevens, the most important fact was simpler. The man who had killed his father had become his friend. And now that friendship had ended, the legacy of their relationship extends beyond the two men who created it. Stevens' children and grandchildren grew up knowing Saburo Sakai not as their grandfather's killer, but as Uncle Saburo, the kind Japanese gentleman who visited occasionally and always brought gifts. They learned that enemies were not monsters, but human beings caught in circumstances larger than themselves. And that forgiveness was not weakness but strength. Stephen's daughter continued to carry Sakai's silk fragment throughout her flying career, retiring from the Air Force as a senior officer without ever experiencing a serious aircraft accident. Whether this was due to Sakai's blessing, superior training, or simple luck was unprovable and ultimately irrelevant. The important fact was that she flew under the protection of a man who had once been her family's enemy and had become their guardian spirit. The silk scarf itself became a family heirloom, passed down with the story of how it was earned and given. Future generations would handle the blood-stained fabric and hear the tale of 2 bullets at 300 miles per hour, a 4-hour flight that defied death, and a friendship that transcended war. They would learn that hatred was a choice, not an obligation, and that the greatest victory was not defeating an enemy, but transforming him into a brother. The broader meaning of Stephen's and Sakai's story lies in its demonstration that the Pacific War's deepest wounds could heal given sufficient time and goodwill. Their friendship proved that warriors could recognize honor in each other, regardless of which flag they had served, and that the children of war's victims could find peace through understanding rather than vengeance. It showed that the most powerful weapon against hatred was not more hatred, but the simple human capacity to see former enemies as fellow human beings. The story also illustrates the random nature of war's casualties and the arbitrary distribution of survival and death. Francis R. Stevens Sr. died because he took a seat that Lyndon Johnson had vacated. Saburo Sakai lived because his willpower exceeded medical possibility. Johnson survived to become president. Stevens left behind 3 children who would grow up without their father. The differences in their fates were determined by seconds and inches. The bathroom break that changed seats. The bullets that missed vital organs by millimeters. What transformed tragedy into triumph was not the events themselves, but the response to those events by the people who lived through their consequences. Stevens Jr. could have nursed his hatred for 45 years, seeking revenge rather than understanding. Sakai could have remained trapped in the warrior's code that recognized only victory and defeat. Instead, both men chose a different path, one that led from death to life, from hatred to love, from war to peace. Their friendship demonstrated that the greatest battles are often fought not in the sky or on the sea, but in the human heart, where the choice between vengeance and forgiveness determines whether wars truly end or merely pause between generations. Stevens and Sakai chose forgiveness, and in doing so, they won a victory greater than any achieved with bullets or bombs. They proved that former enemies could become brothers, and that the wounds of war could heal into scars that reminded rather than tormented. The final irony of their relationship was that the man who had destroyed Stevens' family ultimately saved it from the poison of perpetual hatred. Sakai's bullets had killed Francis R. Stevens Sr., but Sakai's friendship had given Francis R. Stevens Jr. the peace his father's death had stolen. The enemy who had taken life had given blessing. The killer had become protector. The warrior had become peacemaker. Both men served their countries with honor during the war, met as warriors afterward, and parted as brothers when death separated them. Their story stands as proof that even the deepest wounds can heal, that even the bitterest enemies can become friends, and that the human capacity for reconciliation is stronger than any weapon ever forged. In a war fought with industrial efficiency and technological precision, their friendship was a victory achieved through nothing more complex than 2 men choosing to see each other's humanity across an ocean of grief and time. If this story gave you a new way to see the Pacific War, like, share, and subscribe, and tell us which moment surprised you most. We'll return next week with another chapter in the war that changed the world.